Imagine a nation that, by almost every single metric, is completely thriving internally. They're deeply connected to their identity, their population is booming, right? But then, simultaneously on the global stage, this very same nation finds itself increasingly isolated and constantly condemned. It's a really fascinating paradox. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to objectively unpack a pretty provocative, even controversial thesis presented by Israeli academic and strategist Dan Shuftin. We're going to explore his argument that Israel's very strategies for survival actually inherently clash with modern Western ideologies, creating what he calls the Israeli exception. Now, our goal here is not to take political sides, but to clearly and systematically map out his arguments so you can understand the mechanics of this incredibly complex geopolitical perspective.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with Israel versus the zeitgeist, then we'll look at the Western pathology of guilt, Israel's strategy for survival, weaponizing anti-Semitic tropes, and finally, demographics and national identity.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Israel versus the zeitgeist.
To really grasp Shuftin's premise, we first have to look at the fundamental friction he identifies. He argues that Israel finds itself in a highly precarious relationship with the modern world, not in spite of its internal successes, but largely because of them. Their sheer necessities clash directly with the current mood of the West. Take a look at the number 11. Despite facing multi-generational, quite literally existential threats every single day, Israel actually ranks 11th on the global happiness scale. Shuftin points out that when surveyed, Israelis report immense personal satisfaction with their lives. And this directly illustrates his point. Israelis are not acting like victims. They are actively building a robust, constructive society while surrounded by forces that openly state their desire to destroy them. This resilience, he argues, is step one in understanding why they operate so differently from the rest of the world.
So what exactly are they clashing with? Well, Shuftin uses the term zeitgeist, basically the prevailing intellectual and cultural fashions. According to the source material, the post-World War II and post-Cold War West has adopted a zeitgeist based on a profound misunderstanding of the actual dangers facing civilization today. He argues the West has adopted policies centered around universal solidarity and the avoidance of conflict at literally all costs. For the West, these are fashionable intellectual stances. But for Israel, Shuftin argues that adopting those fashions would be literal suicide. For anyone trying to decode global news today, understanding this gap in perception is absolutely crucial. Israel simply cannot afford to pretend the world is safer than it actually is.
And this quote brilliantly illustrates his critique of modern Western ideology. Shuftin argues that radicalizing a good idea ultimately destroys it. He states that just as fascism took healthy nationalism to a toxic extreme, modern progressivism has taken liberalism to a radical edge. His analogy here is pretty striking. He says, traditional liberalism tells you to tie one hand behind your back in a fight so you maintain the moral high ground, right? But progressivism, he argues, demands you tie both hands behind your back to achieve moral perfection. For a nation facing immediate existential threats, tying both hands behind its back is just a luxury it cannot entertain.
Moving on to Section 2, the Western pathology of guilt. How exactly does this build into a pathology of guilt? Well, Shuftin identifies a contrasting dynamic that ultimately isolates Israel. He argues the modern West has become eager to just accept the blame for practically every evil in the world, framing world history strictly through the lens of victims and victimizers, and attributing all failure to things like colonialism or white guilt. Conversely, he identifies what he calls a third world pathology, which is characterized by an absolute unwillingness to accept any responsibility for societal failures, preferring instead to just blame Western intervention for their own backwardness.
And this creates what the source calls an unholy alliance. Because Western progressives desperately want to accept the blame for global suffering, but they don't want to actually take the punishment personally, they sort of outsource that guilt onto Israel. In their eyes, Israel becomes the ultimate expression of Western civilization and the ultimate colonizer. Meanwhile, hostile actors are just thrilled to have Western intellectuals validate their refusal to take responsibility. So both sides unite in punishing Israel simply because Israel aggressively rejects the victimhood narrative and entirely refuses to feel guilty for surviving.
Let's head into Section 3, Israel's strategy for survival.
Why does Israel reject this guilt so fiercely? Shuftin actually traces this back to completely opposite historical traumas. Europe's defining trauma is World War I, this massive, futile loss of life that led Europeans to conclude that war itself is the ultimate evil, and therefore literally anything is better than fighting. But Israel's trauma is the exact opposite. Their trauma, seen in 1973 and terribly on October 7th, is the absolute horror of being unprepared for a war that is inevitable. Shuftin argues that in the Middle East, peace doesn't come from pacifism, it only comes through devastating deterrence. He actually points to the 1979 peace treaty with Egypt as proof that enemies only stop attacking when they are completely convinced they cannot survive the military response.
Because of this, we see a massive divergence in how military force is viewed. The West demands apologetics and overwhelming guilt regarding the use of force. Israel, according to Shuftin, is unapologetic. Now, the source makes sure to note that Israel goes to extreme lengths to minimize civilian casualties, citing the practice of making millions of phone calls to warn civilians to leave targeted buildings. However, Shuftin emphasizes that Israelis fundamentally lack the guilt that the West demands of them when they achieve a military victory against enemies who actively seek their destruction. They are genuinely sorry for civilian suffering, but they absolutely do not feel guilty for winning.
All right, Section 4. Weaponizing anti-Semitic tropes. Because Israel defies the Western zeitgeist so effectively, Shuftin argues its critics often turn to a very ancient arsenal. He outlines 5 classic anti-Semitic templates that are repurposed today by international organizations and the media. First up, portraying Jews as the ultimate evil. Historically, they were accused of killing God. Today, Israel is accused of the ultimate sins against the new secular gods of human rights. Second, dehumanization, what he calls modern blood libels, like framing Israel as intentionally targeting children. Third, conspiracy theories, essentially blaming Israel for global manipulation. Fourth, making Jews the enemy of what you love, meaning socialists can blame them for capitalism and capitalists can blame them for communism. And fifth, the classic accusation of dual loyalty.
But here is the crucial nuance in Shuftin's thesis. He argues that anti-Semitism is often the chosen instrument rather than the conscious motivation of Israel's critics. He uses the example of the German Nobel laureate Günter Grass or institutions like the New York Times. Shuftin posits that these critics might not wake up wanting to be anti-Semitic, but because they so deeply oppose Israel's unapologetic military policies, they conveniently reach into that anti-Semitic arsenal because those weapons are shiny, they've been tested over millennia, and they're incredibly effective at damaging the Jewish state globally.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Demographics and National Identity.
Shuftin views demographics as the absolute ultimate yardstick of a civilization's health, vitality, and belief in its own future. Just look at this multiplier, 20x. To put that into perspective, a person born at the founding of the State of Israel now lives in a country with a population 20 times larger. That is incredible. And this isn't just about immigration, it's fueled by a fierce, shared national narrative and exceptionally high birth rates. He argues that Israelis, even the secular, highly educated citizens, choose to have large families because they possess a strong national identity and a deep belief in the future of their civilization.
Contrast that with how he views the West. Shuftin describes Europe as committing demographic suicide, characterized by declining birth rates where citizens literally no longer have the drive to replace themselves. Because they lack this vital connection to the future, he argues, they desperately search for substitute, fashionable causes to give their lives meaning. Israel, by contrast, he fondly terms a pedocratic state. It's a society where children are quite literally placed at the center of power, purpose, and cultural focus, ensuring the society remains highly motivated to survive and thrive.
This total loss of cultural confidence in the West leads to what Shuftin provocatively terms suicidal empathy. He defines this as the practice of welcoming massive numbers of people from unassimilating, often hostile cultures right into a liberal society, all under the guise of universal, post-national solidarity. Shuftin issues a stark warning here. Because Europe lacks a strong, unapologetic cultural identity to enforce integration, this suicidal empathy will inevitably lead to the destruction of the liberal European societies that enacted it in the first place. Which brings us to a really profound conclusion today. We've summarized Dan Shuftin's argument that the West is essentially paralyzed by guilt and fashionable theories, while Israel survives by unapologetically embracing national identity, military deterrence, and a focus on the future. So the question we have to leave you with is this. If his thesis holds true, can a liberal society actually survive in the long term without a fierce, unapologetic national identity, or is the Israeli exception, prioritizing survival and principle over intellectual fashion, the only real path forward in a deeply hostile world? It is a massive question to ponder. Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer, and we will catch you on the next one.